Well, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, the man behind this conference, Dr. Rob Myers. Rob is the Regional Director of Extension Programs for North Central Regional SARE, and he is based here at MU. And he is also the 2013-14 Endowed Chair of Agricultural Systems at the University of Missouri. So please welcome Rob.
Well, good morning. Just checking to see if we're live back here with the lavalier mic. Okay, I'm going to move that one out of the way. Okay, can you hear me okay in the back? Great. So what I would like to do today is talk about two different things. Some work that we did through the North Central SARE program. And for those of you not familiar with that program, SARE is about a $20 million USDA program on sustainable agriculture research and extension. We do a variety of grants and research, extension, education programs, and also a strong education and outreach program. And to illustrate the value that this program has, I actually heard last night that it looks like Congress is giving us a 30% budget increase, which is amazing in this budget climate. So we were very pleased to hear that. So I'd like to talk about a little work we've had through SARE on cover crops in terms of surveying farmers nationally, and then also what some things are happening with trends around the region and in the Corn Belt with equipment and establishment practices. So first of all, SARE did a survey last year administered through the Conservation Technology Information Center, which is a nonprofit out of Indiana, looking at cover crop acreage around the country in terms of trends, also what's happening with cover crop uses and impacts on corn and soybean yields. And we had a 40-page report on that survey, but I'm just going to show you a few pieces of data from the survey. First of all, we had 750 farmers that participated in the survey. They represented over 200,000 acres of cover crops. Now this was, just to put that in context, we think there was around 1.5 million to 2 million acres of cover crops nationally in the U.S. in 2012. There are actually no good national statistics so far, although the 2012 Ag Census will have a hard number coming out here in a few weeks on cover crop acreage. These were surveys that were distributed online and at a variety of farmer meetings around the Midwest. Most of the responses, because of the distribution at farmer meetings, were within the Mississippi River Basin. Missouri had 35 responses, and again, over 750 altogether. Now, I will say we're repeating this survey this winter. In fact, it just launched yesterday. It's got some additional questions. The yield questions will be repeated. I heard yesterday we had 180 farmers fill it out just yesterday alone. So I expect we'll have an even higher number of participants this year. So what did we see in terms of responses from these 750 farmers? Well, one perception some people who aren't very familiar with cover crops have, well, people are just trying that on their back 40. You know, it's just a small practice, not very significant. But if you can read the small numbers on this chart, going back to 2008, farmers at that time had on average 118 acres of the 750 that responded to this survey. But by 2012, again, this was a survey done a year ago, they had a little over 300 acres. And we're projecting that they would go to over 400 acres this past year in 2013. And this is data that's borne out by surveys of seed sellers of cover crops. They report dramatically rising seed sales over the last few years. It's borne out by cost share across the Midwest, and many other practices. So again, probably about 1.5 million, 2 million acres in 2012, probably closer to 3 million acres or possibly more last year, and we'll see where we go next year. So why are farmers using these cover crops? We asked them that question. I would have guessed maybe 10 years ago most would say soil erosion, and that still shows up as the number 2 thing, right behind though soil compaction reduction. I found that quite interesting. We did have a lot of no-tillers fill out this survey, and they're looking at cover crops as a form of biological tillage. They're not, of course, as no-tillers wanting to take a deep ripper or other tillage instruments out in the field. So they're looking at what can these cover crops provide from a rooting structure standpoint to help open up that soil and help the cash crops root. And we've got a great speaker at lunch, Mike Plummer, who's one of the true experts on cover crops nationally, who will be talking about how cover crops impact cash crops and other factors about cover crops. I was also interested to see number 3, nitrogen scavenging. Again, you go back some years ago, we would have seen more on fixation of nitrogen from legumes, but not so much on the scavenging idea. Can we capture nitrogen that would otherwise be lost from the field before it goes into the tile line or washes away on the surface? Steve Groff, who some of you have heard speak, another leader in cover crops nationally, a farmer in Pennsylvania, likes to say in his presentations, you paid for the fertilizer, so why let it leave the field? Keep it there in the field, and cover crops can help with that. And then, of course, we've got weed control and many other benefits people are looking for. Now, what are farmers using? Again, these were the responses of the 750 plus farmers. Winter cereals is still the big cover crop out there, has been for many years. This would be primarily cereal rye, but also quite a bit of winter wheat, some winter triticale, and of course spring oats would be another common one. However, brassicas has really come into the picture the last several years. If you went back in the 1990s, you'd see almost no brassicas used as cover crops in the United States, but they have rapidly emerged. Many people have heard about a trademark type of radish called tillage radishes. There are other types of radishes being sold. And these have become incredibly popular for a variety of reasons, including the potential to help capture nitrogen at the end of the season. Legumes are still quite popular, but we're seeing a gradual shift in which legumes are being used. Still see, and here in Missouri, some use of traditional forages like red clover. Rob Cullenbach will be talking about some of the forage benefits, but also crimson clover has come on as a popular cover crop. A lot of vetches are still being used and many other legumes, and even summer annual warm season legumes. And then the annual grasses, the big one there is annual ryegrass. Again, Mike Plummer will be talking about this some at lunch, showing a lot of interest in that across the Midwest. The interesting thing, we broke this data down into farmers that had used cover crops for 3 years or more and those that had used it for less. There were a lot of interesting things that came out of that comparison, but one was the longer farmers used cover crops, the more they shifted to mixes of cover crops. And Jody just talked about soil health benefits. Let's keep living roots out there in the soil to improve the soil health, the soil microbial community. You'll hear Bob Kramer talk about the microbial community. These mixes can really help with that. Normally with a cash crop, we like one plant out there because it's easier to manage and harvest and so on. But if you really think about it with cover crops, why not have a blend if we can keep the seed cost under control? Many benefits from doing that. So what about yields? That's really the bottom line question, of course. What's the short-term impact? What's the long-term impact? We didn't know what to expect when we asked farmers about yield, but what we did ask is give us your yield data and then tell us if you've had a situation where you've got fields that have similar management in terms of varieties, planting dates, fertility, and so on, with cover crops and without. Now, a lot of times this happens because these farmers have multiple landlords. Maybe one wants cover crops and one doesn't. But it was quite interesting to see the results. So the blue chart, the blue bars are where they had cover crops, and the red are without. The graph on the left, or figure on the left, is with corn. So the corn after cover crops yielded 126 bushels, average of 234 farmers, and 115 without. Now keep in mind this is the 2012 crop year, and we had tremendous drought that lowered the yields quite a bit. So a little over a 10 bushel increase on corn on average, just for 2012. Likewise with soybeans, we saw 47 bushels on soybeans after cover crops and 42 without, so about a 5 bushel increase. Now we kind of wondered what happens in the hardest hit drought areas. There had been a presumption, especially with crop insurance folks, that cover crops are going to steal moisture from the cash crop. After all, there are plants out there transpiring the moisture from the soil, right? But interestingly, in those hardest hit drought states of Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, the yields actually went up with cover crops being used. So where we had about 9.6% increase on corn nationwide with the respondents, the 200 farmers, with farmers in those 7 drought states, they had a little bit higher yield increase of 11%. And the bump was a little bit bigger in soybeans from 11.6 for all the farmer respondents that had side-by-side comparisons to 14.3 in the hardest hit drought states. So that was quite significant, and it actually led to a change in USDA policy on crop insurance. Before, you had to terminate a cover crop at a certain date in the spring with partly the idea that it would not steal the moisture from the cash crop. They wanted to get it out of the way from a crop insurance standpoint. Now, going into this cropping season, farmers have much more flexibility. There's a new set of rules that are on the NRCS website. If you just Google NRCS cover crop termination guidelines, where the farmers can terminate their cover crop here in Missouri up to 5 days after they plant the cash crop. And I'll show you a photo in a minute of what that might look like. So how consistent was this response? You know, I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought, well, maybe in some states we'll see the reverse, that cover crops negatively impact yield. We looked at a broad cross-section of the states in the Corn Belt, and there was only one state where the cover crops were worse, and that was Minnesota. And in fact, there were only 2 respondents, and when we pulled that data out, one of them had equal yields in Minnesota, and one had quite a bit worse. Maybe they had delayed planting after their cover crops, I'm not sure. But otherwise, the pattern was very consistent that in every one of these states, the yields for corn after cover crops were higher than where the corn was planted without cover crops. And very similar pattern for soybeans across all these states. So again, this was just 2012. We're going to look at that again for this past cropping season, which obviously had different weather conditions. So that's a brief look at some of that cover crop data. If you want to see the full survey report, just go to sare.org, S-A-R-E.org, and look for the cover crop information, or Google SARE cover crop survey. So I've had a chance in my job to travel around to a lot of farms, both private and university, around the region and some outside the region. And one thing you're seeing over and over is people experimenting with cover crops, especially the farmers around the country. And the traditional practice, of course, many of you are familiar with, is going out there with a grain drill after harvest and planting that cover crop, such as the cereal rye after corn in Iowa. You can see the combine harvesting the corn and trying to get in there with that cereal rye as fast as possible. And we know cereal rye we can plant relatively late. Well, Shabu made the comment, cover crops are an age-old practice, but you know, a lot of things have changed. We've got a lot of new species we're trying to use, a lot of new seeding methods, and I want to show you some of that equipment that's being tried or put into use around the country. And part of that is in an effort to get some species that need to be planted early, like these radishes, out there earlier than we might otherwise do after harvesting the corn and beans. So one technique that's starting to show up a lot more is taking high clearance spray equipment and modifying it to broadcast that cover crop seed. So this is a farmer modified rig in Ohio, the Von Tilburg farm, and they've taken a air seeder that's blowing seed out through the tubes and then dropping them down on 38 centers between the corn. And the idea is you go out and do this in mid or late August when the corn is first starting to yellow, and get that seed onto the soil, let the crop leaves fall into it. You can do the same thing with soybeans. And increasingly farmers are doing this as an alternative to aerial seeding, can give maybe a little better distribution, particularly depending on the seeds being used. So some farmers have been doing that, but now the manufacturers are catching on. I had a chance to go through Hagee's manufacturing plant in Iowa this fall. They're coming out with a rig similar to the one I just showed, that'll be a broadcast seeder, but they're also taking their high clearance nitrogen seeding, or nitrogen equipment that you see here. And if you look at this photo, there are little shoes at the bottom of these bars coming down, so right at the bottom, they look like little discs. And they're going to replace those with little cultipacker type things or rolling baskets. They were trying both that can incorporate or press the cover crop seed into the soil, so you're getting better seed-soil contact. And they feel they can run through that corn very successfully in August and do that. So I saw some fields, they'd done this, and it seemed to work pretty well. They're hoping to bring that equipment to the market. And I was interested to hear they actually sell more of these rigs to farmers than they do to the ag retailers because there are so many farmers needing to get over a lot of ground in a hurry. Well, what can we do where we're already going through the field with something else, like the combine? Here's a Gandy box that's mounted on a combine header. And what this is doing is it's blowing the seed. There's a blower right here through some tubes, and the tubes are coming down underneath the row header and broadcasting the seed right here after the stalks are cut. So they're getting onto hopefully bare soil before the leaves and stalks are blown out the back of the combine. So that's one approach to save a trip over the field. Another is if we've got a tillage operation happening anyway, like vertical tillage has become pretty popular. Here's a Salford vertical tillage device. Again, this is a Valmar broadcast seeder, and they're blowing the seed out through these tubes. There's little diverters at the front of the vertical tillage device that are broadcasting that seed and then being incorporated as that's going through the field. How about doing it even earlier? Penn State University came up with what they called their 3-in-1 interseeder, this blue thing. It looks like a conventional grain drill until you get up close to it. And if you look, it's missing one row. So on every 30-inch, they've taken one of the drill units out, and then that can pass the corn through, such as when the corn is knee-high. And then they're planting 3 rows of cover crops drilled in between the corn. But they're doing some other things too. So they've got some drop tubes back here, and one set of tubes is broadcasting side dress nitrogen, liquid nitrogen in a band to give you a side dress nitrogen application when the corn is knee-high. And then there's another set of nozzles that is spraying a broadcast herbicide, such as glyphosate. So that's where the 3-in-1 idea comes, the seeding the cover crop, applying side dress nitrogen, and spraying the herbicide all in one pass. And they've actually had some good success with this, and some farmers are starting to adopt it out in Pennsylvania and some other areas. And this is what it looks like. So this would have been done when the corn was in late June, knee-high or so in Pennsylvania. And this is annual ryegrass. And my understanding is the annual ryegrass will sort of sit dormant until the corn is harvested, and then it takes off and starts growing. And the one that they've had the best success with is annual ryegrass, but they've also done it with some other cover crops as well. Now, many of you that have been out to Bradford Farm have seen this device that Tim procured. It's a roller crimper. If you're not real familiar with these, the idea is that those metal flutes are going to crimp the stem, break the vascular tissue, so kill the cover crop as an alternative to herbicide control or tillage control. But if you looked at that and you're a big 3,000 or 4,000 acre farmer, you say, well, great, but I'm not going to get over all my acres with that. So how about this one? This one is a 60-foot roller crimper that Howard Buffett had built, and they're rolling hairy vetch with this. This was shown at the Farm Progress show this summer in Illinois, and they can get over a lot of ground in a hurry. So just an alternative method out there. One of the benefits, besides potentially not having the herbicide cost, is that you're creating a nice mulch with the cover crop. I think Tim will talk about some of the benefits of that. Well, what if we go out there? I mentioned the new crop insurance rules allow you to plant or control your cover crop after 5 days after planting your corn or soybeans. Why would you do that? Well, here's a field of rye. You can see Tim over there on the left talking on his phone. A very busy man, you know, can't be out there with equipment without talking. So he's in about 5 foot tall cereal rye there. And Tim and Carrie arranged a nice demonstration this spring of, well, let's try planting either after a roller crimper, perpendicular, longitude, and so on. Tim's going to go into this in more detail. My point was more and more farmers are planting their cash crop into a standing cover crop. And I think even a few years ago, we would have looked at that field and say, no way can you plant a cash crop into that. But farmers are being successful doing this. Now, it requires good herbicide control. Kevin's going to talk about that. But you've got to be timely with how you're killing that cover crop. But it can be effective, and some benefits can accrue from doing that. What if we're doing that and we want to roll that cover crop at the same time as we're planting? Here's a regular John Deere planter that's been modified with a roller crimper on the front. So this is a close-up of the unit. It's got little crimper units in between some units that are going to move aside the cover crop residue. So this is what it looks like after it's passed. Now this is a fall operation. You can see some tillage radishes sitting there on the surface. But you're crimping and rolling the cover crop down to create a mat and then pushing the residue aside. It's not really disturbing the soil as much as you might think, so that you can get in there and have sort of the equivalent of a strip till situation. And that equipment is coming to market for this year. And this was the most novel thing I saw in my travels this fall. A robot, this is sold by a company, or not sold yet, it's a prototype by a company out of Minnesota, ROWBOT. Just Google that, you'll find their website. This is a diesel-powered unit that goes through the field. Their vision is that this unit will go through the field 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You'll have a fleet of these out there broadcasting fertilizer or spraying herbicide or broadcasting cover crop seed. And they will come back when they've used up whatever they have in their little tank and refill themselves at the end of the field with seed or fertilizer and get some more diesel fuel while they're there. So that's their vision. I can tell you that the unit did a good job of going through the corn rows using GPS and sensors. They even have been working on, okay, what happens if a kid runs in front of it or a gopher's dug a big hole? It's got to be able to deal with that, but they think they've got those issues solved. So very interesting idea, and they believe they can get through the field when it's wetter than a big high clearance unit could, and obviously can be running all the time. So that's a very interesting idea. But one thing we hear farmers talk about, and then I'll wrap up, is they need to modify other parts of their system. This is a young farmer I visited in Iowa this fall near Nevada. He was using cover crops because he's part of the DuPont cellulosic ethanol system. DuPont is encouraging farmers to use cover crops to replace the corn stover that's being removed in terms of holding the soil in place and organic matter. Well, this farmer normally applied his hog manure and it would disturb 90 to 100% of the soil surface. So he went out and bought a new unit and then made his own modifications so that it would only disturb about 20% of the soil surface, because he's applying that hog manure after the cover crops start growing. So just one of those other changes in management that happens when you start using cover crops. And then I wanted to end with this photo of cover crops being planted for grazing. Rob Cullenbach's going to go into that. But I'm hearing more and more farmers are looking at cover crops for grazing. And it's not just where we have forages in place, but even on regular corn and soybean fields, it's a way for a young farmer to come into that operation and build some forage that they can use to help get into that operation with mom and dad's corn and soybean operation. So just some concluding thoughts. There are a lot of new business opportunities around cover crops. I gave a talk recently and went through about 20 different ways that companies can make income from getting involved with cover crops. And I think if we can get more companies doing this and helping these farmers with their practices, and we're not just simply planting and terminating, but there's a whole set of management changes, that's really going to help with the bottom line goal of getting wide-scale embrace of cover crops. So if we look at the potential out there for ag industry to get involved, whether it's the retail sector with applying cover crop seed or terminating the cover crop seed, companies making equipment, that will have a huge impact in helping cover crops get adopted with all the benefits that we can see across the country. So thank you very much.